We're going to stop for a second because it's not level. The Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. In the rush to 4K, is this camera still relevant? Hi, I'm Doug, and this is Atomic Age Pictures. This is the second in a series of videos that we're doing about the equipment that we use here at Atomic Age Pictures to make our videos. And we make a variety of different kinds of videos here. We do things like this, like tech reviews and camera reviews and that sort of thing. And for that, we're using the camera that's filming me right now, which is a Canon T7i. I'm going to do a video later on about that camera. But for our motion pickups and the more dramatic videos that we do, we use a different camera. And that's this. This is the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. This is a professional level camera, even though it looks like a little Instamatic camera. And I'm not going to go hugely into depth on this camera because there are tons of videos out there about this camera. And at this point, this camera is about 5 years old, so much is already known about it. But I thought I would do a video about why we're using this camera and the things that we like about it and the things that are a little annoying. Now, when this camera was originally released, there was a lot of things that you couldn't do with it that you probably should have been able to do. For example, you couldn't format the card inside the camera. You had to take it to a computer to format it. Well, now with a firmware update, they have rectified a lot of these problems. So now you can format the card inside the camera. You can tell how much time is left on the card now. And that's, again, one of the things that they've added in a firmware update. There are VU meters, so you can tell what sound level you're getting when you're filming. You couldn't tell before what the sound level was. They've also added things like a histogram. These things have added up to making this camera much more usable than it was when it first released. They've listened to the people that are commenting, the people that are using this camera, and they've added in features that people need when they're using this camera in the field, and I agree with that completely. Now, there are still a lot of limitations to this camera. The battery life is terrible. The batteries that come with this camera are these little Nikon batteries. They're about 800 milliamps, and they last maybe 20 minutes. There are some third-party batteries now that have come out that are more like 1200 milliamps, 1500 milliamps, and they last considerably longer in the camera itself. But I opted instead to do an external battery solution. And what I did initially is I bought what they call a brick. It's a battery that's about this big that's normally used to power CCT cameras. If the power goes out, it keeps the camera running for security cameras. And I bought one of these and an adapter cable, and I was able to plug that into the camera, and it would power this camera for about 5 hours. That didn't work out so well. It was awkward and it was clumsy, and it would bang up against the tripod. So I found this, and this is actually a much more elegant solution. When these kinds of things were first released, the manufacturers that were making them, they were, I want to say they were about $90, $100, sometimes maybe $120. I picked this up. It's a copy. It came from China, and I think it cost me about $30. And what this is, it's a little battery solution that takes these Sony batteries, these Sony camcorder batteries. These are the NPF batteries, and you just connect it there and plug this into the camera. It's got a Velcro strap, so you can strap it to the handle of the tripod, or actually anywhere on the tripod that you could mount this. It also has a slide-in adapter, so you can screw this into a hot shoe mount or whatever you wanted to. This battery, this Sony NPF battery, this is a 970. This battery will power this camera for about 5 hours without having to charge it, and that basically is all day. I can shoot all day long with that battery solution and never have to change the battery out. Now, this camera, one of the other things that may be an advantage or may be a disadvantage, it depends on your point of view, is the sensor. The sensor is a 16 millimeter size sensor. In other words, it's about the size of a super 16 millimeter piece of film. And if you're wanting to get shallow depth of field, it makes it somewhat difficult because of the size of the sensor. The smaller the sensor, the deeper the depth of field in relation to the focal length of the lens and the f-stop. Now, one of the cool things about having this size sensor and this active micro four thirds mount, which means that you can put micro four thirds lens on here and they will operate autofocus, and you can control the aperture electronically with it. But one of the advantages of this is that you can get an adapter for this micro four thirds mount, and you can put old school lenses that were designed for 16 millimeter film cameras on this. And there's a large variety of these lenses that were intended for filmmaking. There's a lot of zoom lenses that are the aperture stays constant through the entire zoom range, unlike most still lenses, still zooms. A lot of still zoom lenses, the aperture will change from your widest focal length to the most telephoto end of the focal length. But a lot of those old 16 millimeter cinema lenses, you can zoom and the aperture stays the same all the way through the zoom range. They also typically have a very smooth zoom, so you can do a zoom in the shot and get a very smooth zoom. And they're also have a clickless aperture, so you can change the aperture smoothly and not have it go bup, 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 as you're going through. That is a really neat thing that you can do with this camera that you can't do with a lot of the other cameras, with the possible exception of the digital Bolex camera. But because I have a collection of Canon mount lenses, I really wanted to be able to use all of that glass and not have to invest in a whole bunch of new glass. So I opted to get this. Now, this is a Metabones speed booster, and this is designed specifically for the Blackmagic Cinema Camera, Pocket Cinema Camera. It won't work with any other micro four thirds camera. And what it does is, it does two things. It boosts the aperture, or the f-stop, by 1.5 stops. So a lens that would normally be an f1.8 becomes an f1. And in addition to that, it alters the focal length. So the focal length on a 16 millimeter size sensor becomes closer to, although not exactly, but closer to a Super 35 size sensor. It's a little bit smaller than a Super 35, but it's more in that ballpark. So it allows you to get the shallow depth of field that you want in certain shots, and it allows you to use lenses that you can get a little more wider field of view, because with the 16 millimeter size sensor, something that would be a wide lens on a 35 millimeter camera would be almost a telephoto lens for this. So when you put this on the camera, it effectively changes the focal length of the lenses so that they're much wider and more usable in small spaces. And of course, it also increases the f-stop or the widest end of the aperture, so you get more light in. So a camera that, this is not a low light camera by any stretch of the imagination. I wouldn't shoot anything above ISO 800 in this camera. It just becomes grainy and noisy. But because an f1.8 becomes an f1, you can shoot in some really low light situations with this camera and get really, really good results. Now, these sequences were shot entirely in available light at ISO 800 with a 1.8 lens. Now, it's a very fast lens, so that certainly helps. And we chose locations that were relatively well lit. But you can get very good results in pretty low light situations with the combination of a fast lens and the Metabones speed booster. So the Metabones adapter allows me to put all of my Canon lenses on this camera. And also, I've actually been able to adapt other lenses to this. In fact, one of my newest favorite lenses is a 50mm 1.8 Olympus lens that is from the 1980s. And I was able to get an Olympus to EOS adapter and put this on here with no problems at all. And I just love using that lens on this camera. Now again, there are some problems with this camera that you have to be aware of in order to work around. For example, the sound preamps in this camera are not good at all. They're very noisy, and you have to crank up the gain in order to get usable audio out of it, which makes the sound very noisy. Now there is a workaround for this. If you get a decent preamp and you connect your microphone to the preamp and then go from the preamp into the camera, that means you can turn down the gain in the camera and use the preamp's volume to feed the sound to the camera, and you get much cleaner audio. Last summer I took this camera to San Diego Comic-Con, and I actually had my Zoom recorder attached up here, and had a little cord going into the camera, and I plugged our microphone into that, and we were able to do interviews with people on the floor and get really, really good audio.
What you see here is the Ben Affleck Dawn of Justice suit. The beautiful anatomy that you see in it and the different textures. This is all four-molded leather over motorcycle-grade body armor. So it's not just pretty anatomy. This is actually functional. This will protect you in the event of a fall or some kind of an accident.
So that worked out really well, and we got very good audio recorded in the camera. I didn't have to do any syncing later, which is what I would normally do if we were filming a more dramatic thing where you would synchronize the sound. In that case, I didn't want to have to do that because I wanted to be able to edit very quickly, and it was just simpler to do it that way. And we got very, very usable audio from this. Now, another thing about this camera is that you have basically two modes that you can shoot in terms of the image. There is a Rec 709 built into the camera, which basically what comes out of the camera looks pretty good. You don't have to do too much fiddling with it. You don't have to do too much color correction. But there's also a flat, what they call film picture style. It's extremely flat. In fact, when you bring it into the computer, it looks like there's almost no color at all in the image. And you really do have to stretch it out and bring back the blacks and bring up the color. And it does take a bit of a learning curve to learn how to work with this footage if you're using the flat picture style. It's not just a matter of going in and adding some contrast and boosting the color. You do really have to work with it a little bit. It does come with the free version of DaVinci Resolve, so that if you want to use that particular software, which is a professional color grading software, you can certainly do that with this camera. And I don't use it myself, but I understand that a lot of people really do like using that. Personally, I color grade in my editing software. I find it's perfectly fine for color grading this. You just have to know what you're doing to be able to get the best out of the image. Now, another advantage of the camera having the small sensor is that there's very little rolling shutter. Rolling shutter is where you've seen that before. If you have some cameras, if you do a fast pan from one place to the other, objects tend to bend like this. And because the sensor is small, you don't get as much of that. There's a little bit of it there, but it's not nearly as obvious in some cameras that have larger sensors that are not a global shutter. And again, that's the advantage of using the Metabone Speed Booster, is that your lenses take on the focal lengths of larger size sensors, but because the sensor is small, you don't get the rolling shutter problems nearly to the degree that you would with a larger sensor in the camera. Now again, another thing that I really liked about this camera, frankly, was the customer service. I originally bought a used camera, a used Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. And the reason I bought it used was because I was buying it for a project and I was on a budget, and I needed a camera that could shoot in the wider color spaces that I didn't want to use my DSLR for. And I was able to get it used for about half the price of a new camera. This camera retails for about $999. And I was able to get it for about $500, $550, something like that. After I got the project finished, I went and did some shooting in very low light conditions, and I cranked the ISO up to 1600. And when I got the footage back, I discovered that there were hot pixels all over the sensor. In fact, some of the shots looked like a starry night because there were so many hot pixels. Well, I went ahead and I contacted Blackmagic and told them what was going on. I told them that it was a used camera that I had purchased, but I didn't know how old the camera was at that point, and I didn't know if it was still covered under the factory warranty. So they looked up the camera's serial number for me, and they told me that the factory warranty had literally just run out like 2 weeks before. So they said, tell you what, send the camera in and we'll see if we can calibrate it to get rid of most of those hot pixels. So I said, great, that's fantastic. So I sent the camera in to them, and it was just before the Thanksgiving holiday last year. And when they got it, what they said is basically they were waiting for this calibration machine to come in, and it was going to take them just a few days longer because they were expecting this machine to come in at any time. And about 2 days later, I got another email back from them saying that the calibration machine had not come in, and rather than having me wait over the holiday, which would have been probably another 2 weeks before they got this machine in, they were just going to send me a new camera, or a refurb camera that had already been calibrated. So literally the next day I got in the mail a box, and apparently they didn't have a refurb on the shelf because what they sent me was a brand new camera. So they replaced my used camera with a brand new camera, and it had almost none of the hot pixels. Now, there are still a few hot pixels, and that is something that is a known issue with this camera. It does tend to have issues with the sensor where you get hot pixels, but it really only shows up if you're shooting in very low light situations, which typically you don't do with this camera. But I was really impressed with the customer service. I have nothing but good things to say about the customer service for Blackmagic. Now, something to be aware with this camera, again, like the audio problems, if you've got a lens that will do active micro four thirds, you can do things like adjust the shutter electronically, and you can turn on the autofocus. The problem is that the autofocus in this is nearly useless. About all it's really good for is checking focus before you start shooting. I would never use autofocus on this while I was actually rolling. It is useless. But the kind of shooting that I do with this camera, I don't do autofocus anyway. It's all manual pulling of focus. So that's really not an issue for me in this particular camera. So all in all, it is a remarkable little camera. It produces a stunning image in this tiny little package. And I mean, one of the nice things about this is I could put this lens on here. This is a 50mm lens. I could run around and shoot, and people would not even know that I'm there. Now, I probably wouldn't shoot like this because with a 50mm lens on here, this is going to be very shaky, and it's very hard to get stable footage this way without some kind of a rig. But you could do it. Now, I have outfitted this with a few things. I've mounted a cold shoe on top, so I can mount a monitor, or I can mount a microphone or other things on here. A monitor is definitely a must if you're shooting outdoors. This little screen is almost impossible to see outdoors in the daytime. And it's very small, so pulling focus is difficult. I can do it, but you miss it sometimes, and you have to do a shot over again if you miss it. So having a good size monitor is essential. There are certainly problems with this camera, but you can overcome them if you know how to deal with them. Getting an external battery solution like this deals with the fact that the battery life is terrible in this camera. Getting an external amplifier so that you can plug the microphone directly into the camera and get decent audio. The Metabone Speed Booster allows you to connect lenses and adjust the focal length so that it's more like a Super 35 sensor, plus boosting the light level coming into the camera so that you can shoot in not dark situations, but certainly lower light situations than you would ordinarily be able to if you were connecting native lenses to this camera. The main thing about this camera is that it produces an image that is absolutely unprecedented at this price level. For just under $1,000, you get an image that is absolutely gorgeous, and I think holds up to other cameras that are shooting in 4K. This is not a 4K camera, this is a 1080p camera. But the image is so gorgeous and so cinema-like, so film-like, that I really think the image is much more pleasing than a lot of other cameras that are shooting at higher resolutions but just don't produce this kind of image. So the question is, in the rush to 4K, is the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera still relevant? I think that it is. If you are a filmmaker on a budget, you can do far worse than to pick up a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. It produces a very cinematic image that is very beautiful. And I suspect that most audience members won't know that your film wasn't shot on a much more expensive camera. Anyway, that's my overview of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. I'm going to put a link down below where you can click through to Amazon if you want to purchase one of these. And if you do, that will help support this channel and help me make more videos like this one. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them down below and I can certainly answer any of those. And if you have any requests for any other videos, go ahead and put those down there too. Also, go ahead and click to like this video and hit the little bell because that'll let you know when we've released new videos. So I'm Doug and this is Atomic Age Pictures and this is our review of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera.